I would like to start the presentation with this picture. It's a picture taken 20 years ago when I was making my first forays into, I would say, one of the most beautiful parts of the planet, the Democratic Republic of Congo, more specifically the province of Katanga. I was doing research on the arrival of the first Chinese mining companies, and they at that time still had I would say rather interesting names. On top of these compounds you had Mr. Denny, Huangzhou Mining, and so forth and so forth. But the situation at these sites was very peculiar. Oftentimes you had Chinese with a horde of African workers, with a Chinese only capable of saying plus vite, plus vite. What they were producing was quite limited, but since of course China has made huge transition in terms of its influence on the global mining sector specifically, but also on the global supply chains. And that leads us to a very important sector. What is China seeking to achieve? How far does it stand in terms of its presence and its influence? And what does it mean for the European Union? Those are the three questions that I would like to address in this brief presentation. I think that when we try to take stock of the global mining sector, when we try to take stock of the supply chains more broadly, that it is very important that we are aware of, I would say, a very profound clash of almost economic identities of civilizations. On the one hand, we have Europe, which still profiles itself as a market-driven actor in the global economy, also in the mining sector. On the other hand, we have China, followed by a host of other countries, very much driven by economic nationalism. The main premise of China's mining and minerals policies is still sovereignty and economic security. This is very hard to understand, I would say, for the average European entrepreneur, scientist, or decision maker. But we are speaking of two completely different animals in nature. What China seeks to achieve with its mining policy is security and especially comprehensive national strength. China sees its position along the global supply chains in the mining sector as a contribution to its return as a great power. That means a quest for control, very important. China wants to control. It just doesn't want its companies to control. No, behind the companies, the Chinese state also has to strengthen its grip on the global supply chain upstream the mining sector. And if it gets to depend on non-Chinese suppliers on the international market, so to say, still the role of the government is to boost its control, its bargaining position, its leverage through strategic stockpiles, to offtake agreements, and so forth and so forth. I think a third very important difference with the European Union is that China does not consider its basic industries as backward industries. That's very important. Like in Europe, we came to see mining industry, but also ferrous, non-ferrous processing industries as sunset industries, things that we would rather get rid of and outsource to poor, destitute countries. That's not the case in China. Why not? First of all, it considers that basic industries are key in global supply chains, and if basic industries with their huge infrastructure and investment come, the rest of the supply chain might also be drawn and attracted in China's advantage. That's one reason why basic industries, why mining matters for China, in spite of the pollution, which of course is also increasingly resisted by citizens over there. Second, and I think there's also an important difference in emphasis, China considers basic industries, steel and so forth, as very important opportunities for innovation. Of course, they are very polluting at this stage, but they also hold huge potential for innovation in terms of the quality of the material, in terms of the production processes, and so forth. So instead of letting them go, now that China also becomes more urbanized, China wants to keep them, wants to make them better, and to make them become high-end, less polluting, and more advanced in terms of their input. I would like to highlight that again because it's a very, very stark contrast, you can say, with over 30 years of European politics. We wanted to let them go, and it's still a discussion that we have in this part of Europe, right? When we consider those companies, we mostly highlight the downside, the pollution, but we often are very reluctant to answer the question or to pick up the challenge to try to make them more innovative and more sustainable. Moreover, when we consider China and its ambitions in the mining sector, the processing, it considers that it is only at the middle of its industrialization. It's already a leviathan in terms of manufacturing, in terms of industry, but if you read what Chinese policy documents state, they're only just at halfway what they really want to achieve. Which brings us to policy. I think China's policy upstream the mining sector is about maximizing production at home still. Rare earths are a good example, but there is a raft of other minerals that China wants to exploit more domestically in a more sustainable way. Let's not forget that China's vision for the future of mining is highly ambitious, not only in terms of quantity, but also in quality. It wants to close the small polluting mines, but it wants to make very, very efficient the mines that still hold potential. It wants to do so onshore and offshore. Think of recent exploration activities in the South China Sea, where China is moving very, very, very fast to excavate the minerals from its exclusive economic zone. So maximize production at home, and if necessary, find new resources abroad. Again, onshore, offshore. Onshore, China remains the biggest investor in the minerals industry, but also offshore, we see that China in the Indian Ocean and Pacific is making rapid moves and is sinking massive amounts of investment in both its research and development and early attempts at exploitation. Second, that is that China believes that the last 20 years were, so to say, the adventurous stage, when you had a lot of small companies going out, when there was trial and error, a lot of pollution, a lot of incidents. Now the emphasis shifts towards corporate social responsibility. The emphasis also shifts from small to big investments. The emphasis shifts of, let's say, traditional package deal supported agreements towards more advanced setups, public-private partnerships, for instance, around the mining projects that are being proposed to other mostly developing countries. This, of course, also fits very nicely in the Belt and Road Initiative, China's new Silk Road. The Belt and Road Initiative has a very prominent, and I would say a very elaborate layer of mining activities. China has really a blueprint for the whole Eurasian continent and Africa that consists of all the possible areas, the areas of interest that Chinese mining companies might invest in the future. And it's learning. It's learning very fast. It has made a couple of unprofitable investments in the last 10 years. It's trying to make sure that when it invests, the returns are much, much bigger. Fourth important, very important difference with the European Union, with the West at large, is capital. The China Development Bank at this moment has credit lines to the mining sector for their external activities to the tune of $85 billion. Right? These are concessional loans and other different forms of credit that back China's going out. With, again, not all of this investment being hugely profitable, but I would insist China is learning. It's learning from its mistakes, and it's trying to make sure that when it invests, the return are more significant. Where does it stand? This table is part of a paper that is in your conference package. I would say that in terms of mining, China's overall control is still modest. But let's remember, it's only at the start. So what it has today, from the viewpoint of Beijing, is not sufficient. What I think characterizes China's position and strength today is that it is really indispensable as a processor. And that when the supply chains move to China in terms of processing, that is grip over the mining industry, but also further downstream, the manufacturing and all the activities related, that they will also continue to move. So the polluting part of processing by China is not considered a liability. It's considered core and pivotal in China's attempt to build industries more broadly. Also, in what the Chinese consider control over the well or control over the mine, it still has a way to go. It's not the fact that China really dominates the upstream activities in the mining industries. If we consider the share that is being delivered essentially in China by mines controlled by Chinese companies, for the Chinese it's not yet enough. They want to continue to advance, whether we consider nickel, cobalt, manganese, for instance. For the Chinese, the current level of control is not yet enough. And this is not me saying that. This is what you read in documents of the Chinese Ministry of Industry, the Chinese State Council, and so forth. So what are the consequences for Europe, moving to the conclusion? I would say that China remains a rather modest miner. It's very big in terms of volume, but from a Chinese viewpoint, compared to what it consumes, what it buys, it still don't think its policy is strong enough. It's yet a major processor, and I would say especially an industrial leviathan. So I would say that if from a European viewpoint, and we try to make sense of where China is going, you have to think the way the Chinese think, and it is really to see the whole supply chain, to think laterally. If we do it sector by sector, we get a kaleidoscopic assessment, and I think that is doing damage to reality. And we also see in many ways that China is moving up the value ladder. What have we done so far in terms of the European response? I think that we have been making policy in Europe since about 16 years. Since about 16 years, we have been focusing on this mining industry and the supply chains more globally, especially after 2005-06, when the Chinese started to reduce their rare earth exports. Since we have had a raft of policy documents, I think there are too many to put on this screen, but in terms of results, almost nothing. If we consider, for instance, internal production, the rare minerals that we do produce internally, the volumes have gone down. In terms of nickel, for instance, from 340,000 tons to 280, lithium, manganese, we are still nowhere, and the projects that were in the offing, they are being reconsidered because of internal resentment. Also a bit more downstream in processing, for instance, lithium for the batteries, just still today only 1% of production. So 15 years, right? We have been talking and pondering and contemplating, Commission, member states, a whole host of officials with this kind of result. And of course the Chinese moving fast and the Americans trying to move fast. If we consider our footprint in mining globally, our investment position in mining, extra EU, is actually decreasing, right? Which you see over here. This is Eurostat data. This is the EU FDI stock in mining activities overseas. With the US also it's kind of stagnant, but just consider the figures by comparison. And the EU is around 60 billion euros. The US 160 billion US dollars. China 340 billion US dollars. And then even the Chinese insisting that this is still not enough, right? This is the balance of power in terms of investment that we are talking about. More broadly also in processing and supply chains, we see that the European deficit in trade and important things that rely on those minerals, think of solar panels, think of battery, that this deficit is not going down. So this is really starting to weigh, I would say, on the balance of payment of Europe broadly and individual member states more specifically. So for me, coming to the conclusion, the question is really, why is this time going to be different, right? We have had those discussions for a very, very long time. Now again, you have the Europeans saying we are going for open strategic autonomy. We're going to try to have our own supply chains. But what guarantees, what certainty do we have today that this time is indeed going to be different? That the capital is going to be activated to help strengthen to some degree Europe's control over supply chains, or at least its position. How much are we going to back what is in paper, what is on paper? How much are we going to back that up with deeds? And again, I think that's also the single most important question that we should relay to the representatives of the EC here today. Why should we expect this time to be different? What guarantees do we have that now Europe is going to work in earnest to make sure that it can achieve this promise of open strategic autonomy and more resilience along the supply chains? And there I would like to conclude. Thank you.